the promise of globalization is that it will lead to development in poor countries and that wages will go up and the situation will improve. What's actually happening is we're witnessing a race to the bottom where countries are outbidding each other for who can abuse their workers more.
And when we define slavery, we define it this way, that it's somebody who is controlled by violence, paid nothing, and being economically exploited. Now that, in fact, is the definition of slavery that applies across all of human history.
Slavery is not legal anywhere, but thriving everywhere. In Africa, Asia, and here in the United States. The CIA reports 50,000 women and children are smuggled into the U.S. each year as sex and domestic slaves, or locked away in sweatshops, tricked into coming here with offers of a good job and an education, terrorized into staying.
Taking care of the kids, doing everything in the house, I wasn't getting paid and stuff. So I lived in the house for about 3.5 to 4 years.
Joyce Arimka works with freed slaves in Washington, D.C.
There is so little awareness. Americans don't want to believe that modern-day slavery is occurring.
Dora escaped by jumping from a moving car. Ironically, she was enslaved in this house by an official of the bank, an organization that supposedly tries to alleviate the plight of the world's poor.
Dora's been talking about working here, and we'd like to give your mum the opportunity to tell her side of the story.
The United States. We have around us large numbers of people in slavery. How many people in slavery? We don't know precisely. But I can tell you this. We recently completed a very large study of slavery in the United States, paid for by the United Nations, that we did with the University of California, Berkeley, launched it in Congress last September, and you can download it from our website. In that research, we searched out every single case of slavery in the United States that we could point to, an actual individual who had been in slavery and then come out, and we found over 10,000 individuals. But those are the real ones that we could point to, and this is a hidden crime. This is a hidden crime. So that was at one tip of the iceberg. We also found that the CIA had done research that said that at the present moment they think about 17,000 to 18,000 people a year are being trafficked into the United States to be enslaved in the United States. We also found that in our research with people who helped people who had come out of slavery, that slaves in the United States said that on average, they were being held from 3 to 5 years in slavery. What are they doing? Well, a significant number, not the majority, but a significant proportion are women who have been trafficked into prostitution in the United States. The sex industry in this country is large. It consumes people. One of the things that clients of sex providers want is exoticism and newness. And if you can get women from around the world who are exotic, that's good. That's good for business. So we know that women from Mexico, from Thailand, from China, from Eastern Europe, from everywhere you can think of, West Africa, are all being brought into the United States for enslavement into prostitution. And sadly, at all age ranges as well. We know that people are being brought into the United States and enslaved as agricultural workers. We find them in South Florida, South Texas, and South California in particular, but all the way up the eastern seaboard, even cases in Maine of trafficked workers being taken that far to harvest apples at the peak of the summer. We know that they're being trafficked into this country as domestic servants. You saw the 3 young women from Africa, from the Cameroon, who were enslaved in the Washington, D.C. suburbs as slaves in houses as household help, held for several years in that way. We know that they're being enslaved in restaurants, particularly the Chinese importers have brought lots of people in and serviced the Chinese restaurants around the country in a kind of debt bondage situation in which people find it very difficult to get free. And then, I can tell you that if you can dream it up, you can almost bet a human trafficker has done it. For me, the thing that clicked for me, that told me that we can look for human trafficking almost anywhere, is the fact that when I met someone who's become a good friend, a young man named Given Kachepa, who's now 18 and about to go to university, who was trafficked into this country as an 11-year-old as part of, wait for it, an a cappella boys choir from Zambia, who were then taken from church to church as part of a charity scam, made to sing many, many concerts a day, with collections being taken up to build schools that were never built, to support families that never received any money, and in between concerts were used to do jobs like dig holes for swimming pools, and if they resisted or complained, their food was cut off. These were kids enslaved in the United States as part of a choir. Now that boggled my mind. I have to tell you, that boggled my mind, but it also taught me that if the criminals are clever, and they will find new ways to make money out of human beings in the same way that they can think up new drugs and all kinds of things.
When you buy a pair of shoes, say a Nike pair of shoes, even though there's a Nike swoosh on it, Nike didn't make those shoes. Nike bought those shoes. And the way that they did it is probably they approached a broker in Hong Kong. And that broker in Hong Kong told them which factory could produce those shoes for the cheapest price. So the contract to make those shoes was given to a factory in China, in Vietnam, and Indonesia. But that contractor may then decide that they can even get a cheaper price by contracting with subcontract factories. And at every stage, the amount of money that goes to the workers shrinks, and you end up with this maze of contract and subcontract factories. The Nike paradigm, as it is now called, was held up as the future of the corporate world. Now, what makes a product cheaper, one product cheaper than the next? They can't scrimp too much on materials because obviously there needs to be a baseline level of quality in all the products or they're going to go out of business. So where they usually manage to get the savings is how much they pay the workers.
Human rights groups say Nike pays some workers in Asia less than $1 a day and employs child labor in some of its plants.
And part of the way that you keep wages down is by tightly controlling a workforce, making sure that they don't start forming unions and making demands for things like health care benefits, job security, more control over their lives. These goods are produced in what are called export processing zones. They're often called maquiladoras. What they are special industrial parks that have been set up especially to produce goods for export to the United States, to Canada, to Europe. They are walled in. There are high fences, and there are usually armed guards monitoring these zones. The workforce is incredibly young and almost entirely female. The dominant age is 18 to 25, and I would say that they were about 80% women. And the women who worked there didn't come from the surrounding areas. They came from provinces that were 6 or 7 hours away. This was in the Philippines and Indonesia. And the people who I met said that they felt that this was done on purpose, that they were designing a workforce that was very, very easy to control, that there was a feeling that women were easier to control than men, young women were easier to control than older women, and that girls who are far from their family and their community and their infrastructure, what makes them strong and rooted, are easier to push around. Are constantly feeling scared and unstable, and this is why it's an easier workforce to control. When Nike first started buying its shoes, importing its shoes from contractors, it was dealing primarily with Japanese manufacturers. But then producing products in Japan got too expensive, so they started giving the contracts to manufacturers in Korea and Taiwan. But then workers in Korea and Taiwan started forming unions and started getting higher wages. And Nike and Reebok and all the companies that were producing products in Korea and Taiwan weren't very pleased with this, so they canceled those contracts. Then what happened is that the companies that owned the factories in Korea and Taiwan moved to the Philippines, Vietnam, China, and opened up factories there. The governments in these countries will say, okay, well, we'll give you a 10-year tax holiday. You can come to our country, you can set up a factory, no tariffs, and we'll guard your factory and make sure no pesky union organizers even get in there. And then the company will say, and we have a docile workforce, we can give it to you for 10 cents cheaper a piece. So there's a kind of a global auction going on, and the pawns in this auction are the workers themselves.
We have a law in this country that's been on the books since 1930 that says no prison-made goods can be imported into our country to compete with goods made by free people here. And yet, Chinese goods from Chinese prison factories are flooding our country. Walmart is the largest importer of goods from China, and Walmart is so large that they have individual contracts of procurement with individual prison factories in China, or making individual orders for so many million of this and so many thousand of that. We have prison-made goods flooding our countries, not from countries with due process, but from countries that are very clearly in the business of state-sponsored slavery.
So you often hear companies openly saying that we have made a choice. We have decided to build our brand. But that choice has consequences, and one of the consequences is that when that decision is made, it is often accompanied by a decision to sell off factories and to embrace the Nike model, the company that owns all this intellectual property but doesn't own any factory. When a company decides to embrace this model, that obviously immediately affects their workforces in North America and Europe. People who had steady unionized jobs, were paid enough to support a family, lose those jobs.
Cutting 6,000 jobs.
Now unemployed.
Lost another 42,000 jobs.
Cutting 11,500
Other jobs from factories across the South to plants overseas, where labor is cheaper.
How do you feel about this?
Disgusted.
If it was a place you didn't like coming to, we wouldn't feel this strongly, but it's not like we do what we enjoy, and to be fair, if we're honest, we get paid well for it. I would hold my hands up and say, I'm sorry to go, but we didn't make any money last year. They made a lot of money out of 55
£16 million
people.
out of us last year.
55 people they made a lot of money out of.
And they're not satisfied.
And they're not satisfied. It's pure greed. They betrayed us. They told us we were great. The day they shut us,
workforce.
They told us we were the best workforce that they'd ever. The man stood here, the American man stood here. Is he Canadian?
No, he's American.
American. Said these people that work here are the best workforce that I will probably ever meet.
Come across.
And then we're the people that are sat here, and he's letting us sit here.
Communities that were built around a factory that depended on these factories are often gutted. And the jobs that often come to replace these manufacturing jobs are these new economy jobs that are often service sector jobs. They are often temporary jobs. It's significant that in the U.S. right now, the two largest employers are Walmart and Manpower. Manpower is a company that doesn't produce anything. It supplies people. It is a temp firm, a huge temp firm. They have a roster of temporary workers that they offer to companies on short term.
If you need to move it, clean it, cater it, build it up or tear it down, and you'll get all the help you need.
The service sector jobs are often also short-term jobs, and we hear the term MIC job used to describe people who sell the products for these mega brands like Walmart, The Gap, Nike.
I'm Carol Martin, and this is my McDonald's.
And it strikes me that this is quite a feat on the part of these extraordinarily rich multinational corporations, that they have convinced us, and we have largely accepted this logic, that the jobs that they create should not be held to the same standards as so-called real jobs.